Here we are, it's topic 4. We're looking now at learning tasks that we can use to form students. So we're focusing in on the task design element of that ACAD framework. Remember, the ACAD framework I introduced in the last video has got 3 key elements. They relate to the design of learning tasks, social aspects, and elements relating to place and how places can support learning and formation. We're going to be looking at them separately in this video and the next 2 videos, but I want you to try and keep in mind that all these design elements are, of course, always interconnected with each other. We're just talking about them separately to help us think about the different aspects that we need to consider. So in an earlier video, I talked about how one of the ways we can encourage formation in online courses is by including or embedding informational pedagogies and strategies in the actual required elements of the online courses, rather than only doing them around the edges or in the extracurricular activities. And one of the ways we can do that is by setting learning tasks or assessments that address student formation. So how can learning tasks and assessments contribute to student formation? We're used to thinking about them in terms of assessing kind of cognitive learning outcomes, that kinds of things, making sure students have understood the content of the course. But of course, we can also use learning tasks and assessments to help address student formation. And the reason why they can be helpful is because in any form of learning, it's always a good idea to get students actively learning. By which I mean actively doing things rather than just passively absorbing information and then regurgitating it in an exam or an assignment. So passive learning is not going to be formational because it's not allowing students to really connect with the material at a deep level or to let it impact on themselves in any way. Whereas active learning, by definition, means that students are actively engaged in doing something. And so it's more likely to result in changes and growth in people. So setting learning tasks, things for students to do, enables them to be more active in their learning. And also assessments, interestingly enough, can actually have a formational impact. I was a bit surprised when I did my research and discovered that students reported that assessment tasks often do have a formational impact on them. However, on reflection, it does make sense because assessment tasks are where students spend a lot of their time and where they focus a lot of their attention. And so in that sense, they have the capacity to be memorable and impactful. So that's helpful to know because it suggests to us as we think about our online courses that actually we might be able to shape our assessment tasks in ways that encourage students to consider not only their intellectual or factual learning, but also to reflect on the personal or pastoral or spiritual implications of the topic at hand. So we're going to talk a bit more about that as we go through this session. What sorts of learning tasks are particularly helpful in forming students? Are there particular sorts of tasks that we can apply, particularly in online contexts, that are going to help shape students holistically in the way we want them to be formed? Well, one of the things I did in my doctoral research was to ask online students what particular aspects of their online study experience they found to be formational. And that helped to identify several different kinds of learning tasks or assessments that actually were reported to be formational for students. And these things that they reported are consistent with what learning theory and theological education literature tells us. They're not necessarily brand new things or things that you haven't heard of before. In fact, I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of these. They're part of any educator's toolkit. But knowing that particular kinds of tasks or approaches have ways to form students can be helpful for us because we can then think about how we might use those in our online courses. So the features of learning tasks or assessments that contribute to formation can be summarised in 4 key points. What we need to do is think about how we can develop authentic tasks that help students to apply their learning and develop skills that they're going to need in their life and ministry contexts. Secondly, to have tasks and assessments that help students to actually engage in spiritual practices, whether that's individually or corporately with others. Thirdly, to help students learn how to reflect on practice and to establish lifelong habits of reflecting on practice. And fourthly, supporting students to engage with different perspectives. I'm going to go briefly through each of those and explain what I mean and give you some suggestions about ways you might think about including these kinds of learning tasks in designing online courses or distance courses. So first of all, authentic tasks. What I mean by authentic tasks are those that actually ask students to apply their understanding to real issues or problems, or tasks that are actually undertaken in a real life context, such as supervised ministry practice or preaching a practice sermon in a congregation or something along those lines. Now, authentic tasks that ask students to apply their understanding can be formational because as students apply their understanding, they're more likely to learn more deeply in ways that impact on their own motivations and actions. They're more likely to develop that deeper, grounded, more personal understanding rather than just a simple intellectual assent to an idea or a concept. And there are lots of ways we can ask students to apply their learning as part of their online course participation. For example, in an online course, we might use some online forums in which we set questions for students that encourage them to think about how they can apply their learning, apply it to a particular issue or context, perhaps use a case study or a scenario, or put forward a challenging question, an ethical question perhaps, or an application kind of question that helps students grapple with some of the real life issues that they have to engage with. We can ask those sorts of challenging, reflective questions, as I said, in online forum discussions or perhaps in individual reflection tasks that we set for students or in assignment questions that we set. And the good thing about doing those in an individual assignment or in an online forum discussion is that's a relatively safe context in which students can discuss some of these sometimes challenging issues that might need a little bit of nuance. So whenever we develop a course, we should always be thinking about how we can intentionally encourage students to apply their learning. And we can encourage that in the way we talk to our students as well, either through recorded videos, if we're teaching through recorded videos, or in our live presentations, or in our written teaching materials. If we keep asking those kinds of application questions and expecting students to apply their learning and asking them, how would this work in this particular context? What would you do in this situation? That really is very helpful for students to integrate everything that they're learning together. I mentioned online discussion forums a moment ago, and just as an aside here, I'd like to mention 3 things that I think are essential for running successful online discussion forums. As I said previously, this isn't a course about online learning per se, but here are 3 kind of tips about how you manage an online discussion forum. By an online discussion forum, I mean, sometimes it's called an online discussion board or something like that. It's an asynchronous place where you can put forward a comment or a question and students can respond through a threaded discussion, not in real time, but responding in writing to each other, talking around a topic together, interacting with each other in that asynchronous way. So 3 good things for online discussion forums are make sure you ask good questions. Good questioning, of course, is a great teaching skill, isn't it? And questions that are complex or open-ended or that stimulate students to think rather than questions that are closed or just ask students to respond in fairly kind of predictable ways. Those more complex open-ended questions are the better kinds of ones to ask, and you'll end up with some more interesting discussion around those. It's very important, of course, to ensure that any online forums are carefully facilitated by a teacher or a tutor who is able to prompt and guide and facilitate students in the discussion, but who doesn't dominate or have to have the final word. That's quite a skill, and there are a lot of materials out there about how to facilitate online discussion forums. I'll include some references in the course materials for you. The third thing is to make sure that, and this is a bit of a controversial one, but to make sure that contributions to forums by students are an expected part of their learning, or perhaps even an accessible part of their learning. That gives students a motivation for spending time on that task that you're asking them to do. So many people don't think that accessible discussion forums is a good idea, but it is a way of engaging students in doing something. So that was my little aside about online discussion forums. As we're thinking about authentic learning, as well as the tasks that ask students to apply their learning in online course participation, wherever it's possible, it's also a good idea if we can actually get students to actually go into authentic contexts and engage in real life tasks in those contexts, such as teaching others, maybe leading a Bible study, engaging in a pastoral care situation, preaching a sermon, engaging in supervised practice, all those kinds of ministry skills that we're trying to develop. Wherever possible, if we can get students to do those in authentic contexts, that will really help to cement their learning. It really helps them to develop their own ways of acting and being, and that in itself is a formational thing. And of course, it's very important that we give students feedback and support in those authentic and learning environments, which again is very helpful for them as they are formed. So that's our first sort of category of learning tasks and assessments. Authentic kinds of tasks are really helpful. The second kind of task that's really helpful for encouraging student formation is to encourage them to engage in spiritual practices. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's obvious. Obviously, we're trying to spiritually form students, and so they would engage in spiritual practices. But I'm often quite surprised how frequently theological colleges offer online courses or campus courses in spirituality, but don't actually get their students to actually engage in any spiritual practices. Courses might look at spirituality, the history of spirituality perhaps, or different forms of spirituality, and they might just keep that whole area at arm's length and not connect with a student's own spirituality. The other thing too is that people often assume it's not possible for students to engage in spiritual practices in online settings. But of course, if we think about it, it is. Remember how we spoke earlier about the fact that online students aren't some kind of disembodied people floating around in cyberspace. They're actually real people in their real contexts. So there's no reason why we can't ask them to actually engage in spiritual practices as part of the online courses that they're doing. And this can be quite a significant formational experience for students, as we've discovered here at Ridley College. So if we do have courses that get students to look at spirituality, we can ask them to engage in a variety of different spiritual practices. We can get them to then reflect on those practices, reflect individually, maybe reflect with others on how they're being formed by those practices. I'll give you an example from our guided spiritual formation online course that we run in here at Ridley College. In one part of that subject, we ask students to choose 2 different spiritual practices from a selection that we provide for them, and they engage with those spiritual practices over an extended period of time, over a whole semester. One of those practices they choose can be something that they're already quite comfortable and familiar with. You know, the regular kind of baby Bible reading practice that they already do, or prayer practice that they already do. But the other one that they need to choose needs to be something that is something that they're less familiar with, that they're less comfortable with, depending on their own preferences and personalities. And then students are placed in small groups of 3 or 4 other people, and they participate in those 2 different practices over several weeks, And during that time, they need to engage with each other in the online discussion forums and reflect together on how they found those experiences. And we found that to be a powerful formational experience for our students. I've included some notes about that in the course materials. In another part of that same course, it's based on Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together. We asked students to engage in various communal spiritual practices, not with other students, but with students, with people in their own context and community, where they live or work or fellowship. So students are asked to do things like share an intentional meal with other people, sing together, read the Bible together, share communion together. Again, as an intentional practice, which they then reflect on with their small group in the online context. And again, that's a powerful formative experience for students. It's also an example of doing the kind of thing I mentioned earlier about pushing out students' learning and formation into those real, authentic contexts, which we should be doing whenever we can. One of the reasons why engaging in spiritual practices is formational is because it connects with the forming of people's dispositions. And dispositions are an important part of formation. Dispositions are, as J.K.A. Smith defines them, our precognitive tendencies to act in certain ways and towards certain ends. They're like habitual ways of thinking, habitual ways of being. And they're an important part of formation because they really indicate who we are and what drives us and what shapes us. James K.A. Smith points out that there's a real close connection between dispositions and practices. Our dispositions are actually shaped by our habits and our practices. Practices train people's hearts through their bodies. Smith says that practices are a kind of pedagogy that teaches us in all sorts of precognitive ways to be a certain kind of person. So it's important, according to Smith, that people not only learn about Christian practices, but actually practice them and develop habits of including them in their daily lives, which then shape and form them as people. So a formational learning environment is going to be one that is animated by those intentional practices that can form people and shape their character. So I really want to encourage you to find ways to help your students engage in real spiritual practices and to reflect with others on those experiences during their course of study. Another learning task or approach that's associated with dispositions is our third area of task, which is getting students to engage in reflection on practice or reflective practice. Reflective practice is commonly used in many disciplines, many of the disciplines that involve relationships with other people or connecting with other people, things like sociology, psychology, that kind of thing, teaching. Reflective practice originates with Donald Scone, who came up with a model of reflection in action and helping students to learn how to productively reflect on their own learning and on their own practice and on their own formation is a really important part of formational learning. The point of reflecting, as De Young says, is to be more intentional about how we live as Christians, what sort of character we're called to cultivate, and what practices best enable us to do so. So how can we foster reflective practice in online courses? Well, we can include reflective learning tasks in pretty much any unit of study. We can encourage reflective reading, particularly of scripture. We can incorporate reflection in our assessment tasks. We can do things like ask students to do a self-critique or a self-reflection of something that they have done, whether it's something that they've written, whether it's a sermon that they've preached, a conversation that they've had, or so on. So when we're engaging in reflective practice, it's important to introduce students to a specific model or framework that they can get familiar with, consistently use and apply throughout their course of study. In our context here at Ridley, we use a particular action reflection model of learning. which we introduce students to at the beginning of their course of study. And then they're asked to keep practicing that and applying that in multiple contexts throughout their study. And so in this way, we're equipping students with useful tools in reflective practice that they can take with them into their life beyond study. So it's important, I think, when you're learning a practice of doing things, to include lots of opportunities for reflection using that consistent model. And that helps establish those patterns and habits and familiarity, so that what we end up with is students who virtually automatically take time to reflect on, consider, revise, pray about the way that they're acting, the practices that they're engaging with, the ministry that they're involved in on a day-to-day basis. In terms of online course materials, we can ask students to also just take time out regularly to reflect on their learning. We can set them some reflection questions on the course that they're studying. Whatever the topic is, we can ask them to reflect on that and how that might be meaningful or apply to themselves and to others. Asking students to keep a reflective journal, perhaps also giving them specific questions for reflection, can be a good way of encouraging students in habits of reflection. In terms of reflecting on authentic experience and practical experience, as I said before, it's important to set tasks that ask students to intentionally reflect on these actual experiences or encounters that they have in their life. Again, this is common in many disciplines where reflective practice is engaged to help people to learn more and to integrate what they're doing into the kind of person that they are. Even negative experiences can be helpful to reflect on. Why didn't my sermon go very well? Why did that conversation with that person provoke anger in me? How could I have responded better when that person asked me the difficult question about their father dying? Those kinds of things can be really helpful to reflect on. And enabling students to have a consistent partner or person to reflect with can be really helpful as well. A partner, a mentor or a supervisor can be there alongside the student to guide them to ask those provoking questions, encourage them in their reflection. And writing reflective reports at the end of a practical subject or even at the end of a less practical subject can be a very helpful task or assessment to include for students. There are even ways to engage in group reflection in online contexts. If you've got the capacity to run synchronous meetings, you can of course use those for group reflective practice. But even if you're in an asynchronous context, there are possibilities. You can put people into small groups of 4 or 5 students with whom they regularly interact in online forums, or perhaps they might interact via another agreed form of communication. So there's a bunch of ideas about engaging in reflective practice, which is a really helpful thing for students in terms of formation. The fourth area that I want to mention is it's helpful if we can support students in engaging with differing perspectives. This is an interesting one. I found it interesting in my research that it emerged quite strongly that when students were engaged with other people, with other perspectives, with things that might differ from the way they'd always seen things or thought about things, that could be a really positive formational experience. This is one that we need to be careful of because we don't want to sort of throw people into the deep end and leave them flapping around, not sure of what they believe or anything like that. However, being exposed to and engaging with ideas and input from people of differing backgrounds and learning how to respect and respond to those differing ideas can be really helpful. It can lead to changes in attitudes, behaviours. Our students reported increased tolerance and openness, patience, empathy and humility. And And it can be challenging for students, particularly in theological colleges, to realise that as they're studying the Bible and theology, that not everyone thinks the same as they do, or that not everyone has the same priority on different aspects. And while this can be difficult, students can find it very helpful to recognise how other people differ, to learn respect for others' views, and to value the perspective and feedback of others. This is consistent with transformative learning theory, which was initially proposed by Jack Mezirow. And this theory suggests that exposing students to what he calls disorienting dilemmas can be transformative. It is important to note, however, that we do have to be careful in exposing students to different ideas and approaches. To do that in a supporting way, in hopefully a safe environment, which helps them work through the challenges productively. Because there can, of course, be personal and pastoral implications of exposing students to differing perspectives. So we need to make sure we've got supportive structures in place. Perhaps if we know that there's a complex topic or a difficult topic that often sort of throws people in our online discussions or classes, we can make sure that we're particularly watching out for students during that session and following up any who appear to be having problems. And please let me explain that I'm not saying in any way that, that students should be thinking whatever they like, believing whatever they like, turning away from biblical truth. This is not a call to let's just all believe whatever we want to believe. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that it can be a formative experience for people to work through questions with other people and to recognise and value other people's perspectives. As the proverb says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So in online courses, we can provide students with opportunities to engage with and respond to different perspectives in a range of different ways. We can include learning materials and readings from different perspectives. We can talk about different perspectives in the teaching that we present to students. We might want to critique some of those different perspectives. We can set assignments or forum questions that ask students to explore these different perspectives or to compare them or to come to a conclusion about them. And teachers can also have a formational impact by introducing and helping students and modelling how we can engage with differing perspectives in a productive way. So to sum up what we've said in this video, learning tasks and assessments can be used to help form students, and in online courses it's particularly important that we think about ways we can do that. We've talked about how there's four kind of broad ways, four broad sorts of tasks or assessments that we can think about using that will be formative for students. Authentic tasks that encourage students to apply their learning and develop their skills, and they can be within the online course participation or in authentic contexts where students are actually practicing ministry skills. The second thing is we encourage students to engage in spiritual practices, individually and corporately, and to reflect on those. The third area is engaging in reflective practice, in which students develop those habits of reflecting on their practice thoughtfully, prayerfully, in ways that help them to be formed as better Christian disciples and ministers. And lastly, supporting students to engage with differing perspectives, which enables them to be able to situate themselves and work well with other people. So I encourage you to share some of your own experiences in using these approaches or perhaps other approaches that you used in the online forum for this course. It'd be great if we could hear some stories about what you've done, what works for you in your context. I also have a task for you in this section of the course. And so what I'd like you to do is devise an online assessment or a online learning task that you could use in your context that uses one of those four approaches that we've covered in this video. There's some instructions about how to complete that task in your course materials.